At 71 years old, Loretta Mae Caldwell had given everything she had to a man, a marriage, and a life that turned out to belong to someone else. After 46 years of standing beside Edmund Hargrove Caldwell through his ambitions, his failures, his triumphs, and his silences, she walked into that attorney's office expecting to walk out with her future secured. Instead, she walked out with a rusted key, an address she'd never heard of, and the quiet, devastating understanding that the man she'd loved for nearly 5 decades had left her with almost nothing. At least, that's what everyone in that room believed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Loretta hadn't always been the kind of woman people overlooked. At 25, she'd been sharp, curious, and quietly ambitious. The sort of person who read 3 newspapers before breakfast and argued confidently with anyone who'd engage her. She'd been working as an administrative coordinator for Hargrove Associates, a mid-sized architectural firm in Hartford, Connecticut, when Edmund first noticed her. He was 44, the firm's founder, a man with silver-streaked hair and the kind of measured confidence that filled a room without demanding it. He'd asked her to stay late one Thursday to help finalize a proposal for a municipal contract. They'd worked side by side until past midnight, ordering sandwiches from the deli downstairs. And somewhere between the blueprint revisions and the second cup of coffee, he'd looked at her across the table and said, "You're the only person in this building who actually catches my mistakes before they become problems." She'd laughed and told him that wasn't exactly a romantic compliment. He'd smiled and said he wasn't trying to be romantic. Yet, they married in the spring of 1978. Loretta wore a simple cream dress and carried wildflowers because she'd never been the type for fuss. Edmund's 3 children from his first marriage stood at the edges of the ceremony, like weather systems waiting to move in. Nathaniel was 22, already working at the firm, and already deeply suspicious of the woman his father had chosen. Cecily was 19, beautiful in a calculating way, with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. And Foster was 17, the youngest, still young enough to be openly hostile rather than strategically polite. "You're not what we expected," Cecily told Loretta at the reception, her voice perfectly pleasant, her meaning anything but. Loretta had smiled and replied that most worthwhile things rarely were. It was the last time she won an exchange with Cecily so cleanly. The years that followed were a long education in the art of being present without being acknowledged. Loretta ran the household in Hartford with the same quiet efficiency she'd once brought to the architectural firm. She remembered every birthday, kept track of every grandchild's school play, every graduation, every milestone that Edmund's children would have otherwise let slip through the cracks of their busy, self-focused lives. She organized family Christmases that nobody thanked her for and cooked Thanksgiving dinners that were eaten quickly and without comment. Edmund was not a cruel man. He was in many ways a good one. He was generous with money, gentle in his manner, and he loved Loretta in the particular way that certain men of his generation love their wives, steadily, quietly, and almost entirely without words. He told her she was beautiful maybe a dozen times in 46 years. He held her hand at the movies and brought her coffee without being asked and fixed a broken hinge on the garden gate every time it came loose. But there were distances in him she could never cross. He kept a study on the second floor of their Hartford home that was his alone. He traveled frequently, sometimes for weeks, for reasons he described as client consultations and site assessments. He maintained financial accounts she never saw the statements for. When she'd once asked, early in their marriage, he'd squeezed her hand gently and told her she had enough to manage without worrying about numbers. That she should trust him. She had. For 46 years, she had. Edmund died on a Wednesday morning in late January, 2 weeks after his 87th birthday. Loretta found him in his study, slumped in his leather chair with his reading glasses still on and a half-finished cup of tea on the desk beside him. The doctor said it was a stroke, fast and painless. Loretta stood in the doorway of that study for a long time, looking at the man she'd shared her life with, and felt something she couldn't quite name. Grief, yes, but beneath it, something older and heavier, something that had been accumulating for years without her permission. The funeral brought Hartford out in numbers. Edmund had been a respected figure in the city's architectural and civic communities for over 5 decades. The church held nearly 400 people. Nathaniel, Cecily, and Foster sat in the front row with their spouses and children, a wall of dark clothing and practiced grief. Loretta was placed in the second row. There was a murmured explanation about accommodating Edmund's grandchildren, all 7 of them, in the front row together. Loretta counted the grandchildren. There were 4. She sat in the second row without saying a word. During the reception at Nathaniel's large home in West Hartford, Loretta stood near the window with a cup of tea she hadn't touched and listened to person after person describe Edmund Hargrove Caldwell. His vision, his integrity, his devotion to his children and grandchildren, his enduring legacy in Hartford's skyline. 3 civic buildings that bore his firm's mark. Not one person, in 2 hours of remembrances, mentioned his wife. She drove home alone that night to a house that felt like it had already decided it no longer belonged to her. And she was right. The reading of Edmund's will was scheduled for 10 days after the funeral, held at the downtown Hartford offices of Gerald Whitmore, the estate attorney who had managed Edmund's affairs for the better part of 3 decades. Loretta had met Gerald perhaps a dozen times over the years at firm dinners and civic events. He was a careful, precise man in his late 60s, the kind of attorney who chose every word deliberately and never said to when one would do. She dressed that morning in a charcoal wool dress and the pearl earrings Edmund had given her on their 20th anniversary. Her hands were steady as she fastened them, steadier than she expected. She told herself there was no reason for fear. 46 years, half a century of loyalty and devotion and service and love. Whatever complicated feelings existed between Edmund and his children, he would not have left her exposed. He was not that kind of man. She was certain of that, right up until the moment she wasn't. Nathaniel, Cecily, and Foster arrived together in a black SUV with 2 attorneys between them. People Loretta had never seen before, young and sharp-eyed with the particular alertness of lawyers who'd been briefed extensively before walking into a room. They greeted Loretta in the lobby with careful, clipped politeness, the kind that doesn't invite response, and arranged themselves on one side of the long conference table. Loretta sat across from them, alone, with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight. Gerald Whitmore opened with the standard formalities, the legal language about testamentary capacity and document execution that attorneys use to fill the space before the part everyone is actually there for. Then he moved into the numbers. Edmund Hargrove Caldwell's estate, Gerald said, is valued in total at approximately $9.4 million. This includes the primary residence in Hartford, currently assessed at $2.6 million. Investment portfolios and retirement accounts totaling approximately $5.8 million. The architectural firm Hargrove Associates, held in a business trust and valued conservatively at $1 million. Loretta felt her shoulders loosen slightly. $9.4 million. Edmund had built well, quietly, and carefully the way he did everything. There would be more than enough. She had been foolish to worry. Gerald's voice shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of shift you only notice if you're listening for it. The Hartford residence, he continued, is left in its entirety to Edmund's children from his first marriage. Nathaniel Caldwell, Cecily Caldwell Marsh, and Foster Caldwell, to be divided equally among them or liquidated with proceeds split 3 ways at their discretion. Something cold moved through Loretta's chest. The investment portfolios and retirement accounts, totaling approximately $5.8 million, are distributed equally among the same 3 beneficiaries. She gripped the edge of her chair. Hargrove Associates passes in full to Nathaniel Caldwell as the eldest child and existing senior partner. Loretta heard herself speak before she decided to. Gerald, her voice came out quieter than she intended. What has Edmund left for me? Gerald Whitmore set down the document. He looked at her with an expression she would remember for a long time. Not pity exactly, but something adjacent to it. The face of a man who had argued against something and lost. I need to read this verbatim, he said. Edmund was explicit about that. He picked the document back up. Edmund Hargrove Caldwell states as follows: Loretta Mae Caldwell has lived well throughout the course of our marriage. She has had access to a comfortable home, financial security, social standing, and a quality of life she could not have built independently. I believe this constitutes fair and full provision for a spouse, and I do not feel further obligation to diminish my children's inheritance in her favor. My legacy is my work and my bloodline. It belongs to those who carry my name forward. The room was absolutely silent. Across the table, Nathaniel was looking at his phone. Foster had found something interesting to study in the middle distance. Cecily, to her credit or perhaps just out of habit, was watching Loretta's face with an expression of carefully arranged sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. Gerald continued, his voice heavier now. To Loretta Mae Caldwell, I leave one item from my personal effects. A brass key, currently kept in the top drawer of my study desk, corresponding to the property at 12 Fernwood Drive in Harlow Creek, Vermont. I ask that she visit this property at her earliest convenience. I ask that she trust me one final time. He slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was the key, old and brass-colored, with a length of faded twine threaded through its bow, and a piece of Edmund's personal stationery, his handwriting in the careful architectural print he'd used for 60 years. Loretta, go to Fernwood Drive. Everything I could not say out loud is waiting for you there. Please go. I love you more than you know, and I have always known exactly what I was doing. Cecily broke the silence first. Harlow Creek, she said pleasantly. I believe it's somewhere up near the Canadian border. Daddy mentioned once he'd inherited some old property up there from a relative years ago. So it was barely habitable. She looked at Loretta with that practiced sympathy. At least it's something. Loretta picked up the envelope. She put it in her purse. She stood, thanked Gerald Whitmore by name, and walked out of the conference room without looking at any of Edmund's children. She made it to the parking garage before her legs gave out, and she had to lean against the hood of her car with both hands, breathing carefully, staring at the concrete floor until the world stopped tilting. 46 years, and Edmund had described her as a financial beneficiary whose contract had run its course. She got in her car. She sat there for 20 minutes. Then she drove home to the house that no longer belonged to her, to begin counting the days she had left in it. The will gave Loretta 30 days to vacate the Hartford house. Nathaniel communicated this through Gerald Whitmore's office in a formal letter that arrived 2 days after the reading, written in the language of legal necessity rather than human decency. The letter noted that the property would be listed for sale promptly and that any delay in her departure would complicate the timeline they had established with their real estate agent. It was signed by Nathaniel's attorney, not by Nathaniel himself. Loretta read it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee and then folded it neatly and placed it in the recycling bin. The 30 days that followed were an education in how cruelty operates when it's been dressed up in civility. Nathaniel, Cecily, and Foster began arriving at the house within the first week, not together always, but in rotation, as if they'd worked out a schedule. They brought contractors, real estate agents, an interior designer Cecily had apparently already retained before the will was even read. They walked through rooms with the easy confidence of people who had already mentally redecorated everything. Loretta was in the sitting room one morning, writing letters, when Cecily walked through with the interior designer without knocking, without acknowledging her presence, without so much as a pause. They stood 6 feet from where Loretta sat and discussed pulling out the built-in bookshelves Edmund had designed himself in 1989, replacing them with something more current, more marketable. Loretta kept writing her letter. Her handwriting didn't waver, though her jaw ached from holding it still. Foster was less openly dismissive and somehow worse for it. He would nod at her when he passed in the hallway, a small, careful nod, the kind you give a stranger in an elevator. 46 years of holidays and birthday cards and remembered preferences, and he had condensed her into a polite nod in a hallway. The nights were when the fear arrived properly. Loretta would lie in the bedroom she and Edmund had shared for decades and run the numbers in her head until sleep became impossible. She was 71. Her last paid employment had been in 1978, the year she married Edmund. She had no pension of her own, no savings in her name, no professional contacts who weren't connected to Edmund's world. Social Security would give her something, but not enough, not nearly enough for Hartford, not enough for anywhere reasonable. The Harlow Creek property was almost certainly what Cecily had described. A deteriorating old house somewhere near the Vermont border, inherited from a distant relative, barely habitable. Even if she sold it, the proceeds would be modest at best. She'd calculated it 100 different ways in the dark and arrived at the same answer every time. She had perhaps 3 or 4 years of modest living before the money ran out entirely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Some nights the fear curdled into anger, so sharp it surprised her. Edmund had known. He had sat across from her at that kitchen table for 46 years, had held her hand at the movies and brought her coffee and fixed the garden gate. And all the while he had known what his will said. He had chosen those words. My legacy belongs to those who carry my name forward. He had written that sentence about her specifically and signed his name beneath it. She packed with the methodical care of someone who had nothing left to be sentimental about. 3 suitcases of clothing, 2 boxes of personal items, photographs of her parents, her mother's handwritten recipe cards, a small watercolor her grandmother had painted of the Connecticut shoreline. The books she'd actually chosen herself, rather than inherited from Edmund's collections. That was all she took. 46 years in a house, and it amounted to 2 boxes and 3 suitcases. On the 27th day, she was in the kitchen making tea when she heard Nathaniel and Cecily talking in the dining room. They weren't bothering to lower their voices. She's holding up better than I expected, Cecily said. I thought there'd be more drama. She's practical, Nathaniel replied. Always was. That's about the best thing you can say for her. Loretta poured her tea. She carried it to the window and stood looking out at the garden Edmund had never once helped her plant, and she made herself a single promise. Whatever waited for her in Harlow Creek, she would face it without asking any of these people for a single thing. She kept that promise. Loretta left Hartford on a Thursday morning in early March, before Nathaniel's movers arrived, before anyone could witness her go. She loaded her 3 suitcases and 2 boxes into the back of her 10-year-old Subaru, took one last walk through the garden she'd spent 2 decades building, and got in the car without looking back at the house. Looking back would have cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. The drive to Harlow Creek was 3 hours and 40 minutes according to her GPS, north through Hartford, then northwest through the quiet hill towns of central Vermont. The landscape growing steadily more rural and more beautiful the further she got from the city. March in Vermont meant bare trees and frozen ground and skies the color of old pewter. But there was something clean about it, too, something stripped down and honest that matched her mood better than she expected. She stopped once at a gas station outside Montpelier and sat in the parking lot eating a granola bar she'd found in the glove compartment, looking at Edmund's note on the passenger seat beside her. She'd read it so many times in the past 30 days that she'd memorized it without trying. Everything I could not say out loud is waiting for you there. She folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. The GPS took her off the main highway 40 minutes north of Montpelier onto a two-lane state road that wound through farmland and forest, past frozen ponds and church steeples and small clusters of houses that constituted villages in this part of the world. The towns grew smaller and further apart. The trees grew taller and closer to the road. Loretta kept driving. Harlow Creek appeared without announcement. There was no welcome sign, no gas station marking the edge of town, just a gradual thickening of buildings along the road until she was on something that could reasonably be called a main street. It was smaller than she'd imagined, maybe a dozen storefronts arranged around a modest town square, with a war memorial at its center and 2 maple trees flanking it that had to be well over 100 years old. She drove slowly, taking it in. A hardware store with handwritten prices in the window. A diner called Patsy's with steam on the glass and a chalkboard menu visible from the street. A post office the size of a large closet. A white clapboard library. A bakery, its windows fogged with warmth. A hand-painted sign reading Beaumont's above the door. People noticed her car. That was the first thing she registered, the way people on the sidewalk paused to look. An older man outside the hardware store straightened up from the crate he'd been unpacking and watched her pass with an expression that wasn't curiosity so much as recognition. A woman sweeping the step of the bakery stopped mid-sweep and looked at Loretta's car with the focused attention of someone confirming something they'd been told to watch for. A teenage boy on a bicycle slowed to a stop and stared openly. It was unsettling and oddly comforting at the same time. The GPS directed her left off the main street on a Fernwood Drive, which began as a narrow paved road and transitioned after a quarter-mile in a packed dirt, winding uphill through a corridor of birch trees whose white trunks glowed faintly in the gray afternoon light. The road was rough, pitted with frost heaves, and Loretta drove carefully, her old Subaru managing better than she'd expected. After about a mile, the trees opened up. She stopped the car and sat very still. The property sat in a wide clearing, encircled by birch and pine that had clearly been there for generations. The house itself was old, built from dark timber and stone, 2 stories with a steeply pitched roof and deep covered porches running along the front and side. The roof looked solid. The windows were intact, their frames painted a dark green that had weathered handsomely. A stone chimney rose from the center of the structure, and the whole building had the particular dignity of something built to last and maintained just well enough to do so. The grounds were overgrown, meadow grass gone to seed around the foundation, an old stone wall barely visible under decades of encroaching brush. But there were bones of something deliberate in the landscape, the remnants of a kitchen garden, an apple orchard, 6 or 7 trees, gnarled and unpruned but still standing. A stone path leading from where she'd parked to the front porch steps, its edges blurred by grass, but its direction clear. Loretta sat looking at it for a long time. Then she heard footsteps on the dirt road behind her and turned to see a woman walking toward the car with purpose, carrying a covered basket and wearing the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time and was glad the waiting was finally over. The woman was somewhere in her late 60s, solidly built, with silver hair, cut practically short, and the kind of face that had spent decades outdoors and was better for it. She walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going and had no anxiety about arriving. "You're Loretta," she said, stopping beside the car window. "Not a question." "I am," Loretta said. "How did you know that?" "Edmund described you well enough." She held up the basket. "Estelle Beaumont. I run the bakery on Main Street. Brought you bread, eggs, coffee, some cheese, and soup. Figured you wouldn't have anything in the house yet." She looked past Loretta toward the building in the clearing with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been here many times. "The pantry has dry goods, but nothing fresh. Edmund kept it stocked otherwise." Loretta got out of the car slowly. "Edmund came here every month," Estelle said. "Sometimes more, for as long as anyone in Harlow Creek can remember." She started walking toward the house, clearly expecting Loretta to follow. "He'd stop at the bakery when he came through town, pick up bread and whatever else I had. We'd talk. He talked about you constantly. Showed me photographs on his phone every time, like a man who couldn't quite believe his luck." Loretta followed her up the stone path, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. "He never told me this place existed. Not once in 46 years. Estelle glanced back at her. "He said he couldn't. Said if his children found out about the property before his death, they'd find legal ways to tie it up or claim it. He said they'd been watching his finances and his decisions for years, looking for anything they could use." She reached the front porch and turned to face Loretta. "He told me hiding it from you was the hardest thing he'd ever done, that you deserved to know, but that knowing would have put you in the middle of a fight he wasn't sure he could win while he was still alive." She produced a key from her coat pocket, an old brass key on a length of faded twine, identical to the one in Loretta's envelope. "I've had a spare for years," she said. "Edmund asked me to look after things when he wasn't here." She unlocked the front door and pushed it open. Loretta stepped inside and stopped. The interior was warm, which surprised her first. Then the smell reached her, wood and old paper and something faintly floral, dried lavender perhaps, hanging in small bundles from a beam above the doorway. The The main room was large and low-ceilinged, its floors made from wide pine boards worn smooth by decades of use. A stone fireplace occupied the far wall, its mantel a single slab of dark granite. The furniture was old but carefully chosen, a deep sofa in worn burgundy wool, 2 armchairs positioned near the fire, a long oak table beneath the windows overlooking the back of the property. And then she saw the photographs. They covered the walls in a way that took several seconds to fully absorb. Dozens of them, in simple wooden frames, arranged not randomly, but with clear intention. Loretta at their wedding, young and laughing at something off-camera, her wildflower bouquet blurred with motion. Loretta in the Hartford garden on her knees in the soil, completely absorbed in whatever she was planting. Loretta reading at the kitchen table, afternoon light across her shoulders. Loretta at the top of a hiking trail they'd walked in the Berkshires in 1994, her arms out, her face turned up to the sky. Photographs she hadn't known existed. Moments Edmund had captured without her noticing, over 4 decades of ordinary life, and brought here, framed here, hung here in this house she'd never seen. She stood in the middle of the room and couldn't speak. He called it the keeping room, Estelle said from behind her, her voice gentle. Said it was where he kept the things that mattered most. Loretta walked slowly along the walls, looking at each photograph in turn. Herself at 30, at 40, at 55, at 60. Her face at ages she barely recognized now. All of them candid, unposed, caught in moments of genuine feeling, genuine aliveness. Edmund had been watching her all those years with more attention than she'd known. She reached a photograph near the fireplace that made her stop entirely. It was recent. She could tell by her white hair and the lines of her face. She was sitting in the Hartford garden in late afternoon light, looking at something beyond the frame, her expression one of complete, unguarded peace. She had no memory of that moment. Edmund had seen it and kept it, carried it up here to Vermont, and put it on the wall where he could look at it. She sat down on the burgundy sofa, and for the first time since Edmund died, she wept without trying to stop herself. Estelle sat beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. When the tears finally slowed, Loretta looked up and found the room still there, still warm, still full of evidence that she had been seen, fully and carefully, by the man she'd doubted in her darkest moments over the past 30 days. "There's more," Estelle said quietly. "There's a room he wanted you to find. When you're ready." Loretta took a slow breath. "Show me." Estelle led her to a door at the back of the main room, narrow and low-framed. The kind of door that older houses tuck into corners, as if they prefer certain rooms stay private. It opened into a small study, maybe 10 feet by 12, lined on 3 sides with built-in shelving that ran floor to ceiling. The shelves held no books. Instead, they were filled with document boxes and manila folders, each one labeled in Edmund's precise architectural handwriting, the same careful print she'd seen on thousands of blueprints and letters over 46 years. The fourth wall held a desk, old mahogany, its surface worn smooth at the edges from decades of use, a brass lamp with a green glass shade positioned at one corner. The chair behind it was leather, cracked at the armrest, shaped by long use into something that looked more like a person than a piece of furniture. On the center of the desk, positioned with unmistakable intention, sat a cream-colored envelope. Thick paper, Edmund's handwriting on the front. "For Loretta, when you're ready." Estelle withdrew without being asked, pulling the study door closed behind her. Loretta sat in Edmund's chair. She picked up the envelope, broke the seal, and unfolded 6 pages of his personal stationery, his handwriting covering both sides of each sheet in the careful measured lines of a man who had been composing this letter for a very long time. "My dearest Loretta, if you're reading this, you found your way to Harlow Creek, which means you trusted me one last time when you had every reason not to. I don't take that lightly. I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful for it in ways I never learned to express while I was alive, which is part of why this letter exists at all. I need to explain what I did and why, and I need you to read the whole of it before you decide what to think of me. I inherited 12 Fernwood Drive in the summer of 1977, the year before we married, from my great-uncle Arthur Caldwell, a carpenter and amateur historian who lived in Harlow Creek his entire life and left no children. Arthur's will contained one instruction. He asked that the property go to someone who would value it for what it was rather than what it was worth. I was the only person in the family he trusted with that. I've spent 46 years trying to be worthy of that trust. I began coming to Harlow Creek the first year of our marriage. I told you it was work, site assessments, client meetings, the accumulated excuses of a man who didn't know how to explain that he needed a place to be himself completely. Harlow Creek was that place. The firm, the Hartford house, the social obligations, the children and their judgments, those things required a version of me I found exhausting. Up here I could think clearly. I could remember what I actually believed and what I actually valued. What I valued most was you. I want to be plain about that. The photographs in the main room were taken over 40 years with a small camera I kept in my coat pocket. I brought them here because this was the place where I could look at them without anyone questioning why a man would want to spend an evening looking at pictures of his wife going about her ordinary life. Here, nobody thought that was strange. Here, it was simply the truth. Now I need to tell you what I actually left you, because the will reading was designed to deceive, and you deserve to understand the full design. The Hartford house is assessed at $2.6 million, but it carries a substantial mortgage I took out 2 years ago, a liability Nathaniel, Cecily, and Foster are now entirely responsible for. The sale of the house, after that mortgage is settled and the real estate fees are paid, will net them considerably less than they are expecting. I also placed historic preservation covenants on the property 3 years ago through the Connecticut Historic Preservation Office. Any significant renovation or alteration will require committee approval, environmental review, and public comment periods. Modernizing it the way Cecily wants will take years and cost more than the property gains in value. Fernwood Drive sits on 312 acres of protected woodland. I had the property independently assessed 14 months ago. Conservation groups have already expressed serious interest, and the land alone is valued at $3.8 million. The house, as a registered historic structure, is valued at an additional $900,000. The decision to sell, keep, or develop any of it is entirely yours. Beyond that, I established a property trust in 1979 that has covered all expenses for Fernwood Drive since the beginning. Taxes, utilities, maintenance, insurance. That trust is funded for the next 60 years. You will never pay a bill for this property. The filing cabinets along the north wall contain 46 years of documented information. Some of it concerns clients and colleagues and matters that are simply historical. Some of it concerns Nathaniel, Cecily, and Foster, financial arrangements, personal decisions, and business dealings they would prefer stayed private. I never used any of it. That was not the kind of attorney I wanted to be. But I kept it because I am the kind of attorney who understands that information is the only currency that never devalues. If they come for you, and they may, you have everything you need to stop them. Loretta read the letter twice, through without moving. Then she set it carefully on the desk and sat for a long time with her hands flat on the mahogany surface, looking at Edmund's handwriting, at the evidence of a mind that had been working on her behalf, quietly and without recognition, for nearly 5 decades. She thought about the 30 days of cruelty in Hartford, the movers and the measuring tapes and Cecily's interior designer dismissing the bookshelves Edmund had built himself. She thought about sitting in the second row at the funeral. She thought about Nathaniel's attorney's letter, so clean and legal and indifferent. Then she thought about 312 acres of protected woodland and a property trust funded for 60 years and filing cabinets full of documentation, and she felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been clenched tight for months loosened slowly, like a knot worked free by patient hands. She was 71 years old. She had just inherited a fortress. The legal challenge arrived through Gerald Whitmore's office on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Loretta had settled into Fernwood Drive. Nathaniel had retained a Boston firm, 2 senior partners, and an associate, to argue that the Harlow Creek property constituted a marital asset subject to division under Connecticut law. The filing claimed Edmund had deliberately concealed the property's value during estate planning and that Loretta, as surviving spouse, was entitled to an equitable share of the total marital estate, which by their calculation meant selling Fernwood Drive and splitting the proceeds 4 ways. Gerald called her the morning the filing arrived. "They're aggressive," he said. "I want you prepared." "I'm prepared," Loretta told him. She was standing in Edmund's study at the time, one hand resting on the filing cabinet along the north wall. Edmund was thorough. "I've read everything." "I know he was," Gerald said, and she could hear something in his voice, not quite admiration, but close to it. "I helped him structure parts of it. Call me if you need anything." She thanked him and hung up and stood quietly in the study for a moment. Then she went to make coffee. The Mercedes arrived on a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after the legal filing. Loretta saw it from the upstairs window, picking its way slowly up the Fernwood Drive dirt road, its low-clearance chassis navigating the frost heaves with visible reluctance. Nathaniel was driving. Cecily was in the passenger seat. Foster sat in the back, looking at his phone. She watched them park and get out and stand, looking at the property with expressions that moved through several phases in quick succession. The dismissive confidence they'd arrived with collided almost immediately with what they were actually seeing: the solid stone and timber house, the wide clearing, the ancient tree line, the general atmosphere of a place that had been valued and maintained by someone who understood its worth. Cecily said something to Nathaniel that Loretta couldn't hear. He shook his head. Loretta came downstairs, smoothed her cardigan, and opened the front door before they reached the porch steps. "Nathaniel." "Cecily." "Foster." She stepped back to let them in. "Come inside. I'll make tea." She served them at the oak table in the main room, using the good china she'd found in the kitchen cabinet, simple white with a narrow blue rim, the kind of dishes that had been chosen for daily use rather than display. She poured tea without asking how they took it, because she had spent 46 years knowing exactly how each of them took their tea, information none of them had ever thought to wonder if she possessed. They sat across from her, the 3 of them arranged in an unconscious echo of the conference table at Gerald Whitmore's office. "Old habits." Nathaniel cleared his throat. "Peggy, we've come to discuss the property situation." "Loretta," she said pleasantly. He blinked. "Sorry. My name is Loretta. You've known me for 46 years, Nathaniel." A beat of silence. Cecily's chin lifted slightly. "We believe," Cecily said, taking over with the smoothness of someone accustomed to redirecting conversations, "that this property was significantly underrepresented in the estate valuation. As primary heirs, we feel we have a legitimate legal interest in any asset of this size that was accumulated during the marriage." "The property wasn't accumulated during the marriage," Loretta said. "It was deeded to me as a gift in 1979, the year after Edmund and I married, established as my sole property through a legal instrument your father's attorney filed with the state of Vermont. The deed has been in my name for 46 years. Gerald Whitmore has the full documentation if your attorneys would like to review it." Foster looked up from his phone for the first time. Loretta stood and walked to the study, returning with the folder Edmund had labeled with their names. She set it on the table, between them the way you set down something heavy you've been carrying a long time. "This contains documentation about the trust your father structured for your inheritances. The conditions, the restrictions, the timelines. Things your attorneys will discover piece by piece over the coming months." She sat back down. "It also contains records your father kept over 50 years of legal practice. Some of those records concern the 3 of you." The room was very quiet. Outside, wind moved through the birch trees along the road. "Nathaniel, there are documents here relating to certain financial arrangements you made during the restructuring of the firm in 2019. Arrangements that were legal but would be difficult to explain to the firm's remaining partners." She looked at Cecily. "Your financial settlements from your 2 divorces involved some creative accounting that your ex-husband's attorneys never fully examined. Edmund noted it at the time." She turned to Foster. "Your investment company's filing history has some gaps that a motivated tax authority would find worth closing." None of them spoke. "Your father spent 50 years documenting everything," Loretta said. "He never used any of it. He told me in his letter that using it would have been wrong, and I agree with him. I have no interest in destroying anyone." She picked up her tea. but I have considerable interest in being left alone in my home. So here is what I'm offering, and I'll only offer it once. Drop the legal challenge. Accept the will as written. Go back to Hartford and deal with the mortgage on the house and the preservation covenants and the trust restrictions your father built for you. Leave me out of it entirely." She set her cup down. "If the challenge continues, I'll have no choice but to protect myself using every resource Edmund left me. I'd rather not, but I will." Cecily looked at Nathaniel. Foster looked at the table. Nathaniel looked at Loretta with an expression she had never seen on his face in 46 years, something between reassessment and reluctant respect. "We'll need to discuss this," he said. "Of course," Loretta said. She stood, signaling clearly that the discussion would happen elsewhere. "I'll show you out." She watched the Mercedes navigate back down Fernwood Drive from the front porch, its brake lights flickering at each frost heave. When it disappeared into the birch trees, she went inside, sat in the armchair nearest the fireplace, and allowed herself one long, slow exhale. Edmund had been right. She did everything she needed. Nathaniel dropped the legal challenge 11 days later. Gerald Whitmore called to confirm it on a Wednesday morning while Loretta was in the kitchen at Fernwood Drive, making oatmeal and listening to the birds beginning to return to the tree line as March gave way to April. The challenge had been withdrawn without condition, without counteroffer, without any further communication from Nathaniel, Cecily, or Foster. Gerald said he'd never seen a legal filing abandoned quite so cleanly or quite so fast. Loretta thanked him, finished her oatmeal, and went outside to look at the apple orchard. The months that followed were unlike anything she had experienced in her adult life, and she was 71 years old, which meant she had a considerable amount of adult life to compare them against. The difference was not comfort, though Fernwood Drive was comfortable. It was not financial security, though Edmund had engineered that with the thoroughness he brought to everything. The difference was simpler and more fundamental than either of those things. Nobody needed anything from her. For the first time since 1978, she woke each morning without an agenda that belonged to someone else. She drank her coffee on the covered porch and watched the light change across the clearing and made decisions about her day based entirely on what she actually wanted to do. It was disorienting for the first few weeks, like a muscle that had been held in tension for so long that relaxing it felt wrong. But she stayed with it, and gradually it became something else. Not emptiness, spaciousness. She hired 2 men from Harlow Creek, brothers named Cal and Dennis Pruitt, to help her restore the grounds at Fernwood Drive. They worked through April and May, clearing the overgrown garden beds, repointing the stone wall that ran along the property's eastern edge, pruning the apple orchard back to something that might fruit again by autumn. Loretta worked alongside them most days, her hands in the soil, making decisions about what to keep and what to clear. The physical work suited her in a way she hadn't expected. She slept better than she had in years. Estelle Beaumont became her closest friend, the kind of friendship that develops fast between people who have both lived long enough to skip the preliminary stages. They had dinner together twice a week, alternating between Fernwood Drive and Estelle's house on the edge of town, and they talked for hours about everything and nothing, the way women talk when they finally found someone who listens without agenda. Through Estelle, Loretta met the town properly. The pastor of the white clapboard church, a quiet, thoughtful man named Reverend Aldous Briggs, who'd known Edmund for 20 years and told Loretta that Edmund had funded the church's heating system replacement anonymously 4 years ago and made him promise not to tell anyone. The librarian, a young woman named Priya Anand, who showed Loretta the reading room Edmund had quietly endowed, a sun-filled corner of the library with good chairs and better lighting, used every day by the town's older residents. The elementary school principal, who mentioned in passing that 3 of the school's current students were on scholarships that traced back to a private fund Edmund had established in 2008. Edmund had been living a parallel life in Harlow Creek for 46 years. Not a secret family, not a deception of that kind, but a secret self, the version of him that existed when the weight of Hartford and the firm and his children's expectations was lifted. Here he had been generous and present and known. Here he had been the man Loretta had always glimpsed beneath the careful surface of their marriage, but could never quite reach. She understood him better now than she had when he was alive. That was a strange gift to receive from a dead man, but she accepted it. In June, she found a second envelope. It was tucked into the back of the bottom drawer of Edmund's desk, sealed, labeled in his handwriting. For Loretta's next chapter. Open when the first one feels settled. Inside was a deed to 12 acres on the south edge of Harlow Creek, a parcel with a large timber barn and a stone cottage, both structurally sound, according to the survey Edmund had commissioned 2 years before his death. There is also documentation of a $400,000 trust established specifically, as Edmund's note put it, for whatever Loretta Mae Caldwell decides to build next. His note was 3 sentences. You spent 46 years building a life for everyone else. Now build one for yourself. I already know it will be extraordinary. She sat with that note for a long time. Then she called Estelle. She knew exactly what she wanted to do with the barn and the cottage and the $400,000. She'd known, she realized, from the moment she'd walked into the keeping room and seen her own face looking back at her from every wall. She wanted to create a place for women who had spent their lives the way she had spent hers, in service to others in the background of their own stories, waiting for permission to take up space that was rightfully theirs. She would call it Caldwell Haven. It would offer residencies for women in transition, widows, women leaving difficult situations, women who had simply lost the thread of who they were beneath everything they'd been required to be for everyone else. There would be a garden, because gardens had always been where she thought most clearly. There would be a library, because Edmund had taught her that a space without books was missing something essential. There would be good chairs and decent light, and no requirement to be useful to anyone for any reason unless you chose it. She filed the initial paperwork in July, working with a lawyer in Montpelier who handled nonprofit organizations. By August, the barn was under renovation. By October, the first 3 residents had been accepted, 2 widows and a woman in her 50s who'd spent 20 years as a caregiver for an ailing parent and had no idea, she said in her application, who she was outside of that role. Loretta read that application 3 times. Then she wrote the woman a personal letter telling her she was exactly who Caldwell Haven was built for. On a Saturday in late October, Loretta sat on the front porch of Fernwood Drive and watched the birch trees along the road turn gold in the afternoon light. The apple orchard had fruited, modestly but genuinely, and there were apples in a bowl on the kitchen table that Cal Pruitt had picked that morning. The keeping room was warm behind her, its photographs unchanged, Edmund's letter still in the center drawer of the mahogany desk where she'd returned it after reading it for the last time. She was 71 years old. She had lost everything she thought she had and found everything that actually mattered. The 2 things were not as different as they'd seemed from the outside. Edmund had been flawed in ways that had cost her real pain, his conflict avoidance, his silence, his inability to stand beside her publicly with a conviction he'd carried privately for decades. She had made peace with that, not because the flaws didn't matter, but because the love beneath them had been genuine and the proof of it surrounded her on every side. She had not needed a braver man. She had needed the right ending to a complicated story. Edmund, in his methodical and patient and deeply private way, had made sure she got one. The light shifted across the clearing. Somewhere in the orchard, a bird she couldn't name called twice and went quiet. Loretta pulled her cardigan closer and stayed where she was, in no hurry, belonging completely to the only life that had ever been entirely her own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.